please, let's start. So, thank you for coming. My name is E.Demčenko. I'm coming from Broadcom company. I need to explain you why Broadcom. But first of all, we are developing DevOps tools for ZOS developers. I need to explain you what it means to be ZOS developer and what it means in general. So first of all, Broadcom. You know, Broadcom is the biggest chip producer in the world, except producing CPU and memory. So last year, CA Technologies were acquired by Broadcom. This year, for example, Symantec was acquired by Broadcom. And Broadcom believes in stable tools, or exceptionally, they believe in mission-critical systems, which are running often on ZOS or mainframe systems. So if you imagine payments or payment transactions, almost all of them are still running on ZOS. And some mission-critical systems like power management and so are still running on this architecture of computers. So this architecture, as you know, it's about 40 years old architecture, but still developed. And the problem of this architecture is that there was a change in generation of developers. So the old generation left or about to leave. Some of them already passed, and new generation is coming. Many people believe that mainframe died already, but actually it's developed and it's quite successful business. So why cloud desktop IDEs and what it is? Why it's for mission critical? Actually, I will go to this topic again, but for many years, mainframe developers just didn't believe in desktop. They used to live with command line, and this is their system, and they live for the whole life with command line. So even if they had Eclipse or any kind of UI, it was running in virtual machine on remote desktop. So they usually never used any kind of PC. So this is, okay, sorry. So let me introduce all the topics we are going to cover today. There will be a lot of demos, and the main topic, of course, why to use and how to change these IDs and what we can change. And let's also review the architecture of cloud web based IDEs or JavaScript IDEs. I will have a couple of demos running in Red Hat environment on OpenShift, and also I'll show you TEA IDE, which will run from directly from GitHub. We will review chair architecture. We will review also SIA framework. It's the right name for, we call it TEA, but it's actually SIA. We will review language server protocol, debug adapter protocol. These are the tools, main tools you use for extending your IDEs, and all modern IDEs support it. And at the end, we will see our implementation of our work and summarize what we just discussed during this talk. So at any point, ask me questions or write questions to Slido. So let's start with why. If you Google why to use Cloud IDE, you probably find arguments like flexibility, mobility, cost, easy provisioning, co-deployment. Actually, you can argument with all of these points. Mobility, if you have laptop always with you, you are not going to use web browser. If you are okay with your IntelliJ idea and you have always laptop with you, you use only Java or JavaScript, you are probably fine with IntelliJ. And it's difficult to persuade people, and it's not our goal to change someone's mind, although we want to challenge a little bit the status quo of IntelliJ and similar tools. The cost, it's cheaper. However, sometimes the infrastructure for this environment can be costly, and especially knowledge of people. You still can miss the knowledge of Docker, Kubernetes, and especially the deployment process cannot be obvious. You can go to Google, you can find everything, but once you find a problem, you may not find solution easily. But in my opinion, where the benefit is of these new tools is that they are built from scratch, and they are built already on a standards. And these standards are defined by community. So actually, definition of the standard started actually with Visual Studio Code when Microsoft was pushed to this space, and community defined, let's say, smart editor, and forced them to use some standards and frameworks, and so. And Visual Studio Code, as far as I know, from statistical point of view, is the most successful IDE if you check it on Stack Overflow or Google, because it's easy to download, easy to install, easy to use, and this is where we also started. And many students, if they start developing in Angular or TypeScript, they just download Visual Studio Code and use it. It has a lot of plugins. It's desktop application. However, it can run as web as well. So this is one tool. But there were many different cloud IDEs developed even before Visual Studio Code, like Eclipse Chair or Cloud 9 or other tools. So Chair was acquired by Red Hat, or now Red Hat supports Chair, and Cloud 9 is actually Amazon, supported by Amazon. And these tools came through big transformation. So Chair was what was like 5 years ago is totally different tool now. It's actually Eclipse Chair. If you just wonder why Chair, not Share, it's actually contains some first letters of Ukrainian city, I think. Yeah, one of the Ukrainian cities. So that's why it's Chair. And so what Red Hat did, it transformed the tool into actually manager of workspaces. So it's not IDE anymore. And they removed, for example, dependency on Google Web Toolkit because it was not maintainable anymore, not easy extensible. And they just adopted web IDE called Thea. And even Thea is not IDE itself, it's a framework which you can build into as IDE. So, and if you work for bigger corporations, you may notice that almost all tools you use now are actually running in cloud or on private cloud or in some hybrid cloud. So you may face the situation is that the only tool you still have which runs on your desktop is actually your development environment. And of course, if you are forced, it's not nice idea to change environment. And I definitely do not recommend anyone to change. And for example, we have teams, and I have people who develop in Eclipse. Some people use Visual Studio Code. Some people use IntelliJ. So if they're efficient in one environment or in another, or they know better another one, so why them to force to use something else? However, we should be able to provide something what can be deployed easily, which will contain the stack developers usually need, and so. And especially in case of mainframe developers, where you need something special in your stack, you may have Java, you may have COBOL, you may have assembler. Wow, like if you use IntelliJ for Java, then what are you going to use for COBOL? You can download Eclipse, and on top of Eclipse there is RDZ environment built by IBM. So you are going to use two environments. So the idea is to use standards, and standards are language server protocol, debug adapter protocol, and the system of plugins. So let's go to demo. I certainly recommend you to use to try these pages on Eclipse Chair GitHub. So just the only thing you need is to create an account on Red Hat, and you are going to OpenShift cluster, and you can play with this environment. There are several stacks prepared for you, so you can build your application. You can build Spring Boot, you can build Angular application, and whatever you want. So let's try those pages. So let's go to GitHub page of Eclipse Chair. So this page is nice. They have quite good documentation of what was done. The current version of Chair is 7.1, and actually it's not just Chair. This image is contains Thea as well. But as I mentioned before, Chair is just Workspace Manager. You can use Visual Studio Code with this environment. And even if you use Thea, you don't need to run it in browser. You can run it as desktop. But let's, and you can, of course, download and install it or deploy it on your Kubernetes cluster or OpenShift cluster. But let's use the environment Red Hat has. So you can build your custom workspace, or you can pick one of these predefined workspaces on a page. So let's try, since most of you are also Java developers, let's try Spring Boot. Unfortunately, they do not say what is inside, which components are inside of this workspace, but you can see it in Eclipse Chair. So you cannot say from the beginning which Java version they use. But you see here, it's a part of actually the deployment or DevOps process. So what are you doing here? You are loading your Workspace Manager, and actually you are creating container. You read dev file, and you initialize in Workspace. Then you are actually installing Chair plugins. You installing Thea as a plugin, and each plugin will run its own pod. So this environment can run is single user mode or multi-user mode. If you want to install just Thea, you don't need this multi-user modes just install Thea and play with this. Or if you are going to install multi-user, you need to set up OpenID, you need to use Postgre database, and so and so. So as you see, my environment is ready to work. So what I did, and you see messages, I actually downloaded my workspace from GitHub. And you are ready to go. You have source here, and if you open a Java file, you already have a language server support for Java. So you have syntax check, syntax awareness, syntax semantic coloring preset for you. And you can go and actually start your application here. You can start directly debug, and so. So this is environment you can play with, and I'm not going to go into details. Feel free to debug it, but this environment also has debug adapter protocol implementation, so you can actually try all of the standards. But let's go to Workspace Management and let's see what we have here. So as you see, I played with some other workspaces. I can easily delete them. So like this, boom, it's gone almost. I can stop this environment. When I stop and run it again, I will start from the place where I stopped before. So you can easily add another stack. And why it's useful? You've heard here a lot of presentation when you play with Java 8, with Java 9, with Java 11. If you just want to try, this is good environment for you because it manages your workspaces, and you can stop one environment, run another, and you don't need any help of anyone else. So as you see, there are many predefined stacks here. For example, OpenJDK 8, OpenJDK 11, and so. And there are languages like .NET, and not languages but frameworks. So let's create something else. Let's create. So yeah, this is a description of the stack. But let's create another workspace. Let's create Angular. So you saw the stacks, and you can create your workspace from GitHub, as you did before, or we did before, or I can pick from the list and create a new one. So let's say I want Node.js React web application. You click create, and let's say 10-20 seconds, and maybe a little bit more here, and you have your environment. And as you see, the workflow of workspace creation is described in terminal. So this is fully, this terminal works for any purposes. So you can use it for Git commands, you can play with your environment from this terminal, you can install applications. And as you see, now I created React application. When I created this application, I also loaded language server protocol for JavaScript. And I can now use, again, syntax awareness, syntax check for JavaScript. So let's go back to the presentation and review basically or let me introduce the community which supports and where we actually come with. So why I'm here actually. So if you go to Eclipse projects, let's here. If you Google chair, you probably find, except GitHub, you will find Eclipse.org projects. So you can see the hierarchy of the projects here. And if you go, for example, to Eclipse Cloud Development, you can see how many projects are now in incubation. So this is Eclipse chair. I mentioned Thea, and we recently added our project underneath chair because we are not building something totally new. We are just extending chair for different purposes. So if you see who supports, who is involved, you see several companies like IBM, Red Hat, CA Technologies. Feel free to join community, feel free to add your comments. You may be also interested, as I mentioned, in Thea, because this comes together usually with Eclipse chair, but this project is separate in Eclipse. And these are a little bit different companies who are involved. And you see the list is quite long. So not all of them actually use chair because they say, okay, why do I need to use OpenShift or Kubernetes? For us, it makes sense. For our customers, they want to use multi-user feature of chair. They want to use Kubernetes. For them, this infrastructure is beneficial. But you will see the case where it's just overkill. You don't need it. Or especially if you want to try it yourself, you probably don't need this Kubernetes environment. And some of these companies actually customized Thea environment to run for their own purposes. So the next week there is an Eclipse conference, and this group has own summit inside of this conference. So if you are interested, you can, usually it's about the same time every year, so you can visit this conference as well. They have quite big discussion group as well. So this is our community. Yeah, so I mentioned you chair for Z, mentioned you Thea, but when you start with implementation, for example, of your own language, even here when we discussed after the presentation, we discussed what people do, and I was surprised how many people actually implement language server protocol or implement their own language, or they are going to implement their own language. Although you've heard a lot of presentations about Kotlin, Java, TypeScript, Node.js, PHP, but still there are needs for specific languages. So if you are going to start your implementation of language server protocol, I definitely recommend you this project, this Xtext framework. It's also a part of Eclipse and also supported by some of the companies which I mentioned before, like Typefox, and they have about 10 years experience of implementing language parsers. So yeah, when people start implementation, they usually think about like Untitled and they start playing with this and they're quite successful, but at some point they are stuck and they need help, and this is where they start using frameworks like this. So it should help you with implementation of your language server protocol. So it's also open source project. And as we talk about Xtext and Typefox and Thea, let me show you this funny application which can be very useful for you. And so if you go to Pet Clinic GitHub page, this is just a copy of famous Pet Clinic project under Gitpod repository. I installed the extension for my Chrome browser, but they have also page. If you want, you can go to gitpod.io and just register and start using it, or download download the extension. So you may notice here one little button. It's called Gitpod. So when I click this button, I open my repository, and in several seconds I can start using this environment. And notice that this is not just a smart editor, it's full IDE, and it's exactly the same IDE as I presented you several minutes ago as a part of Chair. And it's exactly the same experience. And as I mentioned, it uses Thea framework, but Thea itself is not IDE. So the IDE in this case is Gitpod, and this is not for free, of course, this project, and you can use I don't know, up to 100 hours for free. They are going to release enterprise support this year as well, so you can review pricing on their pages. But basically, this is exactly the same experience, and you can run debug. You can use language tools here. Let's open one of the Java files, test, let's say, so you can see language support. You can see syntax coloring. You can see basically you can see IntelliSense. You can see documentation of this project. So let's go back to my presentation, and let's review a little bit architecture of Eclipse Chair IDE. So as I mentioned, the current version is 7.1, and the biggest change now is this layer. It's very different from the previous version, and now Chair, as I mentioned, is just a Workspace Controller. And if you review the documentation, what it means, if you scroll down a little bit, you can see what happens when one user creates a workspace or another creates workspace. So you see that every plugin, every user runtime is created in own pod, and the actually current state of the environment is persisted in a database, and you can review this documentation and see what actually you can add or you can extend. And here you see the workflow of workspace creation. And the nice thing about this environment is that you can run actually all of the Visual Studio Code plugins you can find on a marketplace. You can run in this environment. You can install Che plugin. You can create your runtime. You can run TIA, or you can run Visual Studio Code with this. And all of the things, of course, are integrated with GitHub or Git environment in general. So this is Che, and let's review TIA architecture. So this is complex diagram. You can find some more simple diagram, but as I mentioned before, this is TypeScript framework, and it runs as a desktop or web application. It requires, of course, Node.js. It uses Electron framework, and everything depends on how you actually run this application. But yeah, the TEA, let's say IDE, uses JSON RPC, and we will go in a little bit into more details about JSON RPC when we talk about LSP or DAP architecture. And as you see here from the architecture, it's very similar actually to Visual Studio Code architecture. But the difference is defined from scratch. It's more open for the changes. And what is more important, the licensing. So you can bundle this with any of your image. The licensing policy is more, let's say, friendly for open source than Microsoft Visual Studio Code. And this framework can be easy extended, not just you can use plugins, of course, the system of plugins, but it may not be enough for you, so you may want to extend the framework. And it's not really possible with Visual Studio Code. You can use plugins, but you cannot extend it. And Microsoft community may not be so open to extend it. But otherwise, it's very similar framework, however, based on very recent standards. So feel free to join this community and help them to develop it. So, as I mentioned, TEA framework provides multi-language IDE, not just an editor. It runs in cloud or desktop. And this point is very important. It provides extenders with a platform on which to build your own IDE or your own products. You can do it easily with Eclipse, but you may not want to extend Eclipse anymore. And as I mentioned, it provides modern UI using JavaScript libraries. So let's go into details of LSP and DAP. Why LSP and DAP? And you see a lot of Microsoft links here, actually. So it started with Eclipse chair and language support for Eclipse chair. You saw different stacks, like for Java, for .NET, for C++, SQL, and so. When Microsoft saw it, they said, no, guys, you cannot implement language for support for any new language. So let's define a standard, and let's use microservices, let's use JSON RCP, and let's define API. So you can go to these pages and see the history, who actually was in this group, who decided. But as you know, you may not like all of the Microsoft products, but they have quite high implementation culture. So the interface defined quite well. So you may not need any other change of the interface. So if you want to I certainly recommend you this page, and let's see. So this is the description of the interface and what it provides. So this is the workflow and the description of request, response, and diagram how it works with your language server. So, and you see the capabilities. So here you have a protocol with definition of your methods. So you should also understand that there is a piece running on client side and there is a piece running on a server side. LSP itself can run remotely or can run on your desktop. So you can implement actually one multi-threaded LSP which will serve for all of your users, and it will run remotely. We tested this solution, it works fine, but still you may want to run it locally. In case of cloud, of course, or container-based solutions, it will run in container of your current workspace. So everyone will have its own instance of LSP. But if you run it on desktop, LSP will actually run it locally. But remember that it still has two parts. It has client part, it has server part. And since you are Java developers, you may want to use LSP4j. I mentioned Xtext, but usually when people start with implementation, they know Java, so they go to LSP4j. However, many language server protocols or language server implementations are actually implemented in TypeScript. You can see also implementations in C#, and even the funny thing, like we implement at Broadcom language server for COBOL, but you can find another version of COBOL implemented in C#. It doesn't make sense maybe to you, but it's done. There's a company, I think in Netherlands, implemented COBOL language support in C#, but this is supposed to run with Eclipse. So sometimes these language server implementations are strange. However, there are about 40 language servers implemented. So you can see here on there is another website called Language Server. So let's review it. language server org. I'm adding this link because people who just start with implementation, they may be okay. Yeah, of course, they can be confused with all of this documentation, where it comes from. So here's also description of what is LSP and why it's good, and you can see the support of the languages. You can see the features and who actually implemented this. You can see C# from OmniSharp, you can see C# from another company, you can see C++ implementations. And you may want to add yours as well. So for example, CSS is coming from Microsoft, and you can see even Broadcom here. So it's nice, and you can see the features language server support. So there are many languages implemented, but still, as I mentioned before, you can have your own reason, and I heard here that people still implement their own even if there is a support for the language. For example, I think it was today there was a presentation about Kotlin native, and they mentioned that it's not working fine in IntelliJ. So if you have this implementation, it ensures that it will work fine in Visual Studio Code or in TEA or Eclipse, but even IntelliJ has a plugin for LSP and DAP, so you can, using this plugin, you can turn on the languages you need. So people usually do not try it, but it's possible to use even these exotic languages with IntelliJ. So let's go back to DAP. LSP is more or less clear. It's basically implementation of syntax awareness or syntax checks or all of the language features. But DAP is a debug adapter protocol. So you still have to have your own debugger. So, for example, in our case, if we have COBOL, you have a special debugger which should run on mainframe. On mainframe architecture, it's not possible to run it locally or on any desktop application. So this debugger should run remotely, and it's still beneficial to use debug adapter protocol because you will use all of the features from the interface. So let's this is again Microsoft documentation, and you can see the idea why we may want to have debug adapter protocol implementation. You can have editor or IDE, and if it supports the same protocol, you can reuse the implementation. So this is the implementation diagram. So I definitely recommend you to go to Che blog. There is an article from one of the developers from Eclipse Che about debug adapter protocol implementation. So this person implemented several debug adapters, and they can definitely help you with your implementation. And I hope that next year we will be able to show you there is no space for this kind of thing, but when you run debug adapter for mainframe and you want to debug transaction in kicks region, you may not even notice how many layers or how many tools or technologies are involved, how complex it can be. So it brings you a big advantage of hiding all of this complexity behind behind the protocol, and actually in IDE you feel like you use just normal Java debugger. Of course, you have to understand the specific of your debugger. Sometimes you may not expect some of the details as in Java you may not expect in other languages. So let's go back to the presentation, and I will show you our own implementation and why we do this. So first of all, let me show you the view what mainframe developers, so maybe for the whole life. So this is the green screen. This is the environment they use for development. So I run command line, and most of these tools are running in production for like 30 years, and some of them are still number one in this business and quite successful, and you may be surprised with what these tools can actually do. So for example, one of the tools we have it's called Source Control Manager, but this is like a combination of GitHub, Jenkins, and bunch of deployment scripts together, because this system is able to actually edit code, test code, deploy code, and so. But why we are going to use it? I mentioned you why we are talking about DAP or LSP. I mentioned you at the beginning the change of generation. So companies which moved already from mainframe to distributed, they are gone. They are not going to use mainframe anymore. But there are still many companies, or actually the biggest players are still using it, and they actually want to invest in new hardware, in new software, and so. And they need to hire new developers because the old are gone already. So when people after the university come, and when they see Windows like this or command line like this, they say, no, we are not going to use it. I want to use GitHub. I'm not going to use this system. But in production, I still have, I may have 2 million of files, and I may not want to use them. And if I calculate the price of moving this code somewhere else, it could be fantastic, like because you are not going to change millions of files, and you are not going to change. If you move it from mainframe, then you need to use some another builder or compiler, and so, and you need to change your whole infrastructure, your whole transaction systems. So for the companies, it's better to provide some kind of integration with new tools like GitHub or, let's say, Visual Studio Code to use this environment. So in order to see, let's say, to browse files, I may go like this, example, one of my files is archived, so I need to say that no, I don't want to move back from archive. So, and while I'm doing this, I will prepare you the environment. Our own environment. You saw Che running in OpenShift infrastructure, and now I'm presenting you exactly the same image, but running in our own infrastructure. And I stopped working on this workspace some time ago, so I just want to open it and start from where I finished. And while I'm running this, I'm still waiting for mainframe. Okay, so now I can look for my file on mainframe, and I need to pass these screens, and now I can actually go and, let's say, see my COBOL code, and it looks like this. So it took me some time to get to the file. I don't have any language support. So the only problem I can see when I save this file and run compilation, I will see the errors. Here in this modern environment, if I go to my files, I already have syntax highlighting. I have syntax check, syntax awareness. I can browse my files. I can it's also a secure environment and ask me for to confirm the password. So I can see my different subsystems. I can see stages. I can see different stations and different environments like dev, QA, production, and so. And this improves my efficiency. This improves the learning curve. So when student comes of the university, they are not scared about this code. So if they develop code in Java, so they don't see as a big deal if they have smart editors and language support. They are not so afraid to use these environments. And in our case, for example, students from Charles University came and they developed school projects, and they implemented actually support for assembler. We are going to open source this project as well. Unfortunately, they developed this in C++, not in Java, but this will be also open source. And the funny thing, it can be, even if it's C++, it can be extremely important for other students who can join this kind of companies and help to support and develop, or even move to Java, move applications which are already running there. So hopefully I explained the reason behind why we develop it. So I think we are about to finish. So let me summarize. What are the options for extending cloud IDEs. I mentioned language server protocol, so feel free to implement your languages. You can use Xtext to help you with this implementation. You may want to implement your debug adapter protocol if you already have some debuggers, or you are planning to implement debugger. So you may want to have debug adapter protocol. So you can reuse some plugins from, let's say, Visual Studio called Marketplace, or you can implement your own. You can use Thea framework to extend. You can extend Thea framework. You can write extensions. You can define your stacks. You can have in your stack different components like Java 11, Java 13, Java 8, OpenJDK, and so you can build your own images. You can publish this on in, for example, Che environment, or you can work with, for example, Gitpod people and add your support there as well. So these are the ways to extend cloud or web IDEs. So let's see the questions, and I'm happy we have. What are the options to perform dev testing in Che workspace? How can we provide test data, perform external requests, and so? It's very good question. So you can do with Eclipse Che everything what you can do normally without Che. So, but the good thing with Che is that you can use web. There are different types of tests, of course. If you talk about end-to-end testing, so your choice could be Selenium, Cucumber, and so, and you can just create test suites, test cases, record or develop your test cases and actually click through this through your Windows, or let's say use browser to test the application. But you can install any test framework to run unit tests there. So if you use Java, JUnit is your option. External requests, it depends what it means external. If it's if you have Che in public cloud, okay, you need to have some generic maybe user account to test it. But if you have it in your own, you may have like single user installation, and you can. It's still external request, but you can test. You can, and again, you need to separate two things here. If you test UI or you test actually backend, so you can run backend and test it. But if you want to test just your extension, you don't need to use Che to test it. You can use Jest for testing. Do you know? Okay, so Xtext project, Untitled 3 or 4. Okay. No, I don't know, but I would say 3, but just check the documentation. I'm not sure about this. So thank you for your attention, and hopefully you will try one of these tools for your own purposes. Thank you.